In this video, you're going to build another example using the grid layout, but this time you're going to use something similar to coordinates that you would use in geometry. But the coordinates you're going to use with grid are a little bit different from the ones you use in a 2D plan. So the starting file is going to have a container with items inside it. So I've already converted the container to a grid. So all the items inside it are grid items. So at the moment, it's a basic grid of 16 grid items, each grid item occupying one cell in the grid. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to place each grid item inside the grid using some coordinates. So let's understand how this works. So the placement is going to involve the first 6 grid items. So let's give these grid items an ID, or let's go for the first 5 only. So let's give the first one an ID Apple, then Facebook, Microsoft, Samsung, and Google. So I'm going to select them later on using their IDs. Now, just to differentiate between these divs, I'm going to call the second Apple div Apple 2. I'm going to do the same thing with Facebook and the others. And let's call the other ones Amazon 3 and so on. So now I can easily differentiate between these divs inside the grid container. Now let's go to Apple and use coordinates to place Apple inside our grid. So I'm going to select the Apple div using its ID, and then I'm going to use some new properties to place Apple inside the grid. So I'm going to use coordinates here, meaning that I'm going to tell the browser where Apple is going to start and where it's going to finish. So for example, let's say that Apple is going to start right there and is going to end right there. Now, if you look at that point, that's the intersection of that line and that line. So that line is actually the start of that column, and that line is actually the start of that row. So the property we're going to use here for the start of Apple is going to start with grid row start, and then I'm going to have grid column start. And I'm going to specify where that row starts and where that column starts. So the first line in our grid, or the first column in our grid, starts right there. So that's the line where that column starts. So that's line number 1. And then that's line number 2, which is the start of column number 2. And then line number 3 is the start of column number 3. So here we go. Our point there is grid column start 1 and grid row start 1 as well, because that line is the start of that row, which is the first row. All right, so the starting point is having the coordinates 1 and 1, which is the first line horizontally and the first line vertically. Now we want Apple to end right there, meaning it's going to occupy these 2 cells, right? So the end point is that one, which is the intersection of that line and that line. So we're going to have another property, which is grid row and, which is 3. So if you count from the top, so that's line number 1, 2, 3, and that's our point there. So we're going to have grid row and 3, and then grid column and 1, 2, 3, and that's going to be 3 as well. Here we go. So Apple now occupies all that space, starting from that point until that point. All right, so you can actually combine these properties, if you like, using one single property, grid area, which you used before. So here, to make things simple, we can use one line and start with the grid row start, which is 1, then the grid column start, which is 1 as well, then the grid row end, then the grid column end. So I'm going to comment all of that, and using this line of CSS will be enough to place Apple right there, occupying 4 cells, starting from that point and ending in that point. Now imagine that you gave a name to your first column right there. So when you specify the width of columns, you can give a name, as we've seen before, to your columns, and let's call this one column 1 left. Now this is going to be the name of the column, but if you use it in your grid area and replace the grid column start with the name of that column, then it's going to mean the line where that column starts. So if I write column 1 left, it's still going to work. Instead of writing 1, I just wrote the name of the column, and here we mean the starting line of that column. So you can do this with any column or any row in your templates, and just make sure that you understand that if you use the name of the column in your coordinates, then you're going to be referring to the starting line of the column or the starting line of the row. All right. Now let's move to the next grid item, Facebook, and make sure that Facebook starts, for example, right there, and occupies 1 cell. So I'm going to select Facebook using its ID, and then I'm going to use the grid area property, just like there. And let's start with the starting line, which is line number 3. Horizontally, and the starting line vertically is also line number 3. Now, without specifying the end of Facebook, Facebook took automatically 1 cell. So it occupies 1 cell by default. So if you don't specify the end points, then it's going to occupy 1 cell like this. So it's going to move from that point 1 unit to the right and 1 unit to the bottom. All right. Now let's move to Microsoft and do something similar using the grid area property. But this time, I'm going to tell the browser, start in the point 3, 1, which is this one, which is the intersection of line number 3 horizontally and line number 1 vertically, or instead the 3rd horizontal line and the 1st vertical line. And then I don't want Microsoft to occupy only 1 cell. I want Microsoft to span 2 cells horizontally and 2 cells vertically. So how can we do this? Well, instead of specifying the endpoints, I'm going to say that Microsoft is going to span 2 cells horizontally and 2 cells vertically like this. And this is what's happened. Now, you will mention something really interesting here. The order of our grid items have now changed. So normally we start with Amazon, or we start with Apple, then Facebook. But here, Facebook doesn't come right after Apple. And that's because we changed how our items are placed on our grid. Also, if you look at Apple 2, for example, which is supposed to come right before Facebook, or Facebook 2, it's now right there, following Amazon, and coming right before Microsoft. So, since we've got some empty spots inside our grid, because we placed some items using coordinates, some of our grid items are going to occupy those blank spots, such as Apple 2. All right? So now you must be comfortable using coordinates to place your items or your grid items inside the grid container. So you can either specify the starting point and the end points, and you can use a name for the start of the column. So let's go back to using numbers for now. I'm going to show you later another way of using named grid areas. You can specify the starting point only, and then automatically the grid item is going to occupy one cell. Otherwise, you can specify the starting point and then specify how many rows and then how many columns you want that item to span. And just make sure that it is going to be span rows, then columns. All right, now let's move to the next grid item, Samsung. And let's just give it a grid area starting at 0.51 and then ending at 5.5. So it starts right there as the horizontal line 5 and the vertical line 1, and then it ends right there as the intersection of horizontal line 5 and vertical line 5. Perfect. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the grid container, and I'm going to call the grid areas, or name them, like this. So we've got a template of 4 by 4. So let's call the first row A, B, C, D. Then let's have E, F, G, H. Then I, J, K, L. And finally M, N, O, P. So these are the names of the areas inside our grid template. Now there is another way of placing your grid items. So if I go to Google, I can place it using grid areas. So for example, if I specify that Google is going to occupy the grid area B, then that's where I'm going to see Google. It simply took the place of that cell, which we called B, or the grid area called B. Now, if I say that Google is starting at B/P, it's going to give me exactly the same results. Now, what if I place Google right there? Well, all I need to do is say that it's going to occupy the area D. And here Google goes. Now, if I want, I can make Google start at H and finish at B. This means that it's going to occupy all these three areas or three cells, H, L, and P. So how can I do this? Well, it should start at H. So I'm going to say it starts right there. That's the starting point. So I don't need to use coordinates in this case because I've got named areas. And then I'm going to say that it ends at B. So I'm going to specify that the endpoint is BB. Perfect. So that's where Google goes this time. And again, any empty spots are going to be filled with the other grid items, just like this one and that one. All right, so hopefully this gave you a good understanding of how to use coordinates to place your grid items inside a grid container, and also how to use named areas to make a grid item span over a certain number of cells. So in the next video, you're going to learn how to align grid items inside your grid container.